So I want to welcome everybody to our program tonight. Classi Lectures, Classi Conversations is this part of our program, is partnering with BethTtikvah Synagogue to bring you some fabulous authors and interviewers and some great reading over the summer. I want to start tonight by just saying thank you to everybody who has shown me such support during the last month since my husband passed away. Today is the end of the Shloshim, so I'm kind of back in, and we're excited for Classi Lectures to continue bringing you great programming. This is the beginning of a three-part series, our virtual summer reading series. So this week we've got Jonathan Kaufman on the Last Kings of Shanghai. Next week we have Florence Adler, interviewed by our very own Gail Kurtzman. And that's next Wednesday, July 28th, and then Letters from Across the Sea with Canadian bestselling author Genevieve Graham on Wednesday, August the 11th. So I want to thank Rabbi Sachs for being our interviewer and helping facilitate this. I want to thank Jonathan for being here, and I want to thank Gail Kurtzman for really being a superstar at this shul for making special event planning possible. For those of you who don't know Rabbi Louis Sachs, we are very fortunate at BethTtikvah because he is our assistant rabbi par excellence and a super interviewer for these programs where we're bringing history to life for you. He was born in LA. He joined BethTtikvah as an associate rabbi in 2017. So I think he attended UC Davis and graduated with a degree in religious studies. He then studied in Jerusalem at the Curtis Center for Jewish Studies, returned to LA at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, and then came to BethTtikvah. He has a passion for young people and educating young people and Jewish ethics, and has been a great promoter of Classi Lectures, where he's been our interviewer on a number of occasions. I'm going to let you, Rabbi, talk to Jonathan and start the program tonight. I'm going to remind everyone that you are we are going to mute you, and to please turn your screens off during the interview because it's just easier. And then join us at the Q&A at the end. And feel free to put your questions as we're going through in the chat, and then we'll talk at the end. Okay, everyone, enjoy.
Thank you so much, Sue, for that introduction and for organizing all of this. It is always a pleasure to get to partner with Classi Lectures for these types of programs. And today I am particularly pleased to get to sit down with Jonathan Kaufman to talk about his newest book, The Last Kings of Shanghai. Jonathan is a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who has written and reported on China for 30 years for the Boston Globe, where he covered the 1989 massacre in Tiananmen Square, the Wall Street Journal, where he served as China bureau chief from 2002 to 2005, and Bloomberg News. He is author of A Hole in the Heart of the World, Being Jewish in Eastern Europe, and Broken Alliance, The Turbulent Times Between Blacks and Jews in America, winner of the National Jewish Book Award. He is the director of the School of Journalism at Northeastern University in Boston. And tonight it is a pleasure, Jonathan, to welcome you to our virtual stage. So welcome.
Thanks very much. I'm happy to be here.
Today, we're here really to talk about your newest book, The Last Kings of Shanghai, which was really just a fascinating read. I got to be honest, these days I don't get to read too much in the way of non-Jewish specific books, things that are the Parsha or something that I can really go for in a class. The occasional novel I get to fit in. So it was really, really a treat to get to read this book because it is steeped in knowledge and detailed and information about these families, and yet it was such an easy read. It was almost in a sense like a novel where you really felt attached to the characters and to the stories as you laid them out. So really just to begin, I'll again say it's in the chat where people can get the book from a local bookseller here in Canada, but fill us in a little bit on what the book's about and why you wrote it and how we came to be here tonight.
Sure. No, I'm happy to do it. I often say the past year since the book came out, I feel like I've been living under a Yiddish curse, which is, may your book come out during a pandemic when all the bookstores are closed. So it's nice to be able to kind of join with all of you and talk about the book and hear your questions. As you say, I'm
lecture circuit easier though. Sorry for interrupting, right? But the lecture circuit's probably a little more comfortable for you, no?
well, yeah, I mean, it is, although, Zoom is a way to kind of reach people all around the world. So I've enjoyed that. So, as you say, I'm a journalist, and my interest in this book and this topic really started back in the late 70s when I was a young foreign correspondent um, sent to China for the first time. And I was in Shanghai. And again, this was back in the late 1970s when it was still Red China. Chairman Mao had just died recently. Everybody on the street was wearing those blue Mao suits we remember. There were far more bicycles than cars. And I was walking along and I had to use the bathroom. And so I went into a hotel and I sort of stepped through the door and I felt like I was walking into a movie set from the 1930s. Here in the middle of communist China, there were these beautiful marble floors, crystal chandeliers, beautiful stained glass windows. A bellhop came up to me all dressed in white. And when I asked him, where the bathroom was in English, he responded to me in French. And so I left there trying to figure out, like, what was this place? And I asked around, and someone told me that this had once been the greatest hotel in Shanghai, one of the greatest hotels in Asia, and it had been built by a Jewish playboy millionaire named Victor Sassoon in the 1930s, when he was one of the richest men in Shanghai and a real man about town. So I kind of filed that away the way journalists do. And then at a later point, I was actually living in China with my family, based in Beijing. And my family, our kids were little at the time, and they really loved exploring Shanghai. It was really a very interesting city, and we'd go down there on weekends and for vacations. And at one point, I was with my wife and our kids, and we were going through this very old neighborhood of Shanghai. And I noticed on the doorpost of many of the tenements, there were the shadows of mezuzahs, not mezuzahs themselves, but the shadows where they had once been. And once again, I thought to myself, what are mezuzahs doing in the middle of Shanghai? And as it turned out, and as I discovered, these were mezuzahs that had been put up by the 18,000 Jewish refugees who had fled Nazism and found safety in Shanghai in the 1930s and 1940s. So as I kind of gathered these kind of flashes of a Jewish presence in Shanghai, I decided I wanted to find out kind of what was going on. And that led me to these two families who, as it turned out, were not only immensely wealthy, they're originally from Baghdad, but that they'd essentially stood astride Chinese politics and business and culture for 175 years, and people really didn't know about them. And that was how I decided to write this book. I think you're muted.
You're muted.
There we go. I'm supposed to be the hip rabbi, the young rabbi who knows technology, but sometimes it gets the best of all of us. I was saying it's amazing how things sometimes just fall into place almost. You had these experiences and these moments that set you up for this story that you brought out in such an incredible way. I'm curious, before we dive a little bit more into the book itself, how did you go about the research for this? Because you talk about letters between the brothers that they're sending back and forth. You have the journal of the wife of Eli Sassoon, I think it was.
Kodori.
Eli Kodori. But did you get your hands on all of these different documents and have to travel around, or how did that go about the process of writing?
Once I decided to write about these two families, I reached out to them and I said, I want to tell your story. In a way, I was fortunate. This was before the days of texting, before the days of Instagram. People actually wrote letters and they kept journals. What's interesting is that both of these families started in Baghdad. We all know the typical story, or the very familiar story of Jews, which is the Fiddler on the Roof story. Jews who started in ghettos or shtetls in Eastern Europe or in Russia or in Canada or in the United States, and then kind of moved up and then succeeded and did very well. These two families actually started in Baghdad. And in fact, we read about them in the Bible when we read about by the waters of Babylon we wept when we remembered Zion. Babylon was Baghdad. And these Jews were kidnapped actually after the destruction of the temple, brought to Babylon as captives. But while they may have wept by the rivers, they actually were extraordinarily successful. And the Sassoon family became incredibly wealthy, had all these trading networks emanating from Baghdad. And in fact, the head of the Sassoon family was so prominent that when the local ruler, the Pasha or the Turkish ruler who was ruling Baghdad at the time, would want to meet with him, the Sassoon leader, the head of the family, was carried through the streets in a sedan chair. And everybody, Jew or Gentile, would bow their head respectfully and to acknowledge how influential and powerful the Sassoons were. Now, politics turned against the Sassoons, and David Sassoon, the patriarch of the family, had to flee Baghdad. But he quickly established himself in India and then in China and had 8 sons. And he essentially sent his sons all around the world to build this global business dynasty. Some to China, some to other parts of India, occasionally back to Baghdad, and some to London. And the way he kept track of all of this was that with these 8 sons, he would write to each son every day. You know, for those of us who complain that our children or grandchildren never call us enough or never write, he would literally sit down every evening and write letters to all 8 of his sons and then read the responses that they got back. So fortunately, a lot of those letters were kept. There are about 7,000 of them that ended up at the library in Jerusalem. The problem was that they were written in Judeo-Arabic, which is a language that only the Jews of Baghdad spoke, and very few people speak today. But I was fortunate enough to find a professor who knew the language and was able to translate these for them. The other family I write about, the Kodori family, they're today the richest Western family in China. They're worth $13 billion. And one of the things that happens when you're worth $13 billion is you're able to organize all those photos we collect and all the letters we have. They've actually organized it into a formal archive. And one of the remarkable things that was there was that Laura Kodori, who moved to China in 1902, kept a diary of her time there. And it's very rare to have women kind of keep diaries and write letters in a way that, you know, live on, that we can actually see them and sort of hear their voice. And so I was given that diary, and it's almost like reading, you know, Katharine Hepburn in some movie like The African Queen, as Laura Kodori describes, traveling through China, seeing the civil wars, seeing all the poverty. So I was able, kind of by going to various archives all around the world, to see the way in which these families wrote about their experiences, and others wrote about them. Because on the one hand, I could hear how the Sassoons were writing to each other, but I could also get the diaries of British aristocrats who knew the Sassoons and were very anti-Semitic and would make all these snide remarks about them being Jewish. So you also saw some of the tensions that surrounded these families, even as they became millionaires and very influential. Socially, they still were never always accepted by a lot of the British and others around them.
There are so many different parts of that I want to talk about, but we'll dive in a little bit more maybe with Laura Kodori, because I was just fascinated by, like you said, it's ahead of her time to write a journal like that, but she really seemed like a woman out of place in history, with the travels, with the involvement in the family life and the community, and even the story at the end. And maybe that's why she's one of my favorite characters, because she ended up giving up her own life, running back in to try to save one of the women that worked for them when they were in China. versus with the Sassoon family and the opium trade, I have some moral questions. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. And then I'm curious your thoughts on how do we today judge moral characters of the past? Because there seems to be a lot of that going on in the world. And what is our role today in terms of casting judgment on the ethical or questionable decisions of those who've come before us?
Right. No. I mean, it's a tough question, but incredibly important. So as I said, David Sassoon had to flee Baghdad, and he settles in India. And because he has a tremendous amount of business acumen, he very quickly becomes a millionaire. And then when China opens up, he's looking for business opportunities. And one of the biggest business opportunities in China was selling opium. A number of British firms were selling opium and smuggling opium into China. The Chinese empire was very much opposed to it. Opium was a real scourge of China back in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. About 12% of Chinese citizens were addicted to opium. Now, as a comparison, these days, about 2% of Americans, and I would suspect maybe roughly the same amount in Canada, are addicted to opioids. And we know the kind of turmoil that's caused and the anger and so forth. So imagine 6 times that. And so the Chinese very much wanted to forbid the sale of opium. But British companies saw tremendous profits to be made. And in fact, they went to war. Britain went to war to open up China to the opium trade. They defeated the Chinese, and the opium trade became legal. At that point, David Sassoon saw a great business opportunity. He saw that he could grow opium in India, and then using kind of technological advances, really beat out all his rivals. The Sassoons early on invested in steamships, which got the opium faster from India to China, as opposed to sailing ships that their rivals used. They were the first investors in the telegraph, which allowed the sons of David Sassoon to communicate whether now was a good time to sell opium or not. And so within about 20 years, David Sassoon had essentially driven all of his competitors out of the opium trade. The Sassoons completely controlled the opium trade to China. When the communists took over and conquered Shanghai in 1949, they seized the Sassoon business records. And I was able to see them. And they concluded that the Sassoons made about $1 billion, B for billion, $1 billion US from the opium trade. And they used that money to invest in other things. So, Balzac has that famous line that behind every great fortune is a crime, and the crime was opium. Now, when you talk to the Sassoons now, they say, well, it was like cigarettes, it was like alcohol, sort of like the Bronfmans and alcohol or things like that. It was a vice, but it was legal, and this was how we made our money. But it's more complex than that, because the Sassoons knew how dangerous opium was. None of them used opium themselves. There was, in fact, a movement starting in the 1870s to ban the opium trade, which the Sassoons fought very aggressively. And even among their own employees, when you look at their business records, they often had to fire Chinese employees who had become useless because they were so addicted to opium. So it is a moral question. I think as Jews, we like to think that, well, our values matter, Jews are going to be more ethical in business, and so forth. The fact is the Sassoons were also imperialists. They were colonialists, and they saw a business opportunity here. And I think in the end, like many imperialists and colonialists, didn't quite see the Chinese as being on the same level. It didn't matter to them as much that they were making all this money, but causing so much heartache. In terms of how we judge that, obviously we can judge it. I think we have to look at them in their time. But I think it's also fair to say that these were, moral decisions that, were incorrect and that had a real price. And I think that, perhaps it's humbling for us as Jews to recognize that, there are Jews who sometimes act badly, just as there are, others who act badly.
It's certainly, I think, one of those things that as Jews we always hate, when there's a Jew in the news for something not so nice. And when it happens, right, we feel all a bit of guilt, I think, along with it, or a bit of shame. And that for me is one of the difficult things, and one of the reasons why I loved Laura Kodori in the story, because she really seemed to be the standard for ethics and for seeing people that were different than her as still of value. And
No, I
yet,
think,
sorry, I was
you
going
know,
to say, sorry, please, please.
I think you're absolutely right. I think Laura Kodori in some ways became the conscience of the Kodori family. She was a very unusual woman. Her husband, Eli Kodori, had come from Baghdad, had made a lot of money very quickly in China, and in his 30s basically decided it was time to find a wife. He sailed to London, where he met Laura, who was the daughter of kind of a Jewish, very well-to-do Jewish family. They married, and typically what would have happened was that they would have gotten married, Laura would have gotten pregnant, Ellie would have sailed back to China, made his fortune, come back and kind of, visited a couple of times a year. But Laura was very independent spirited. She was in fact older than her husband. Her family was worried that she would never marry. But once she married, she announced that she was going to go to China with her husband. And they sailed together to Hong Kong. She had 2 children very quickly. And then, in an even more extraordinary moment, says, I'm going to accompany you as you go to China and do your business deals. So while Ellie was doing these business deals and amassing his fortune, Laura really got a kind of ground view of what things were like in China. The incredible poverty in the 19th century, the diseases, the way in which China was being carved up. And she concluded that the real cause of China's problems was that girls were uneducated. She believed that if girls could get an education, that could help China and help them get out of this misery. And so she began to persuade her husband to invest in Chinese schools for girls. Now, remember, this is the early 1900s. No one is doing this. People are just, exploiting China and kind of making whatever money they can. But Laura works very hard. She also begins to build schools for girls in Baghdad, where she works with families there. And so I think that she did become kind of the conscience of the family. And eventually the family settled in Shanghai, in a mansion in Shanghai. And there was a house fire there. And Laura ran out of the mansion. But she was convinced that the governess she had hired, the Chinese servant, to take care of her 2 boys, was still trapped inside. So she ran back inside to save the governess. She got disoriented by the smoke. She couldn't find her way out. In fact, the governess had escaped through another door, and Laura was overcome by the smoke and she died. Now, that was clearly a tragedy for the Kodori family, but for the Chinese, they were kind of stunned by this. The idea that a well-born, wealthy foreign woman would rush in to save the life of a Chinese servant was something that they just couldn't imagine. And the Chinese actually tell this story even today of what Laura Kodori did. And I think you see an incredible impact she has on the family going forward, their involvement in charity and philanthropy. But among ordinary Chinese, this kind of story that got passed on down, I think not only meant that they looked at the Kodoris in a different way, but also they looked at Jews in a different way. China is one of the few places in the world where, there isn't much anti-Semitism. And there are complex reasons for that. But one of them is stories like this one about Laura Kodori, where ordinary Chinese kind of thought these Jews are not like all the other Westerners, they're somehow different. And that was part of her legacy. But I think it was also part of her legacy that as a woman in those times, she was limited in what she could do. But she certainly made the most of her time.
Yes, he certainly lived up and accomplished quite a bit, more than, like you said, other women of that time, and in her independence and the traveling and all of the journeys. Actually, another woman we'll go to in a minute, Flora Sassoon, who also stood out a bit. But I'm curious also, just go back to David Sassoon just briefly, because you talk in the book as well about some of the charitable endeavors, the things he did, giving money for Jews in Baghdad, or sorry, in Bombay, people facing poverty, synagogues, even freed his slave, and built the first hospital that would actually treat Indian patients. So I'm just struck by the complexity of these characters. They're kind of good and bad. They imperialist, colonialism, profiteering, and also, in a way, giving back to at least certainly the Jewish community. But even there, David gave back to the local community as well. Was that
I
their Jewish values, or is that, and what do you account for that kind of?
I think one of the reasons I was drawn to these two families is that they felt very familiar to me. They were a lot richer, but in the end, we wouldn't be surprised to see them as members on the Zoom call or members of your congregation. For me, they fall into, like the Bronfmans or like Michael Bloomberg, or, these are families and people who you would write about anyway because they are so prominent and are so influential in kind of society. But then because of their Jewish background, it kind of adds, as you say, layers of complexity to it. And I think we have to embrace that complexity. So David Sassoon, you're right, he was very philanthropic, but he also had kind of a business aspect to this. As his empire expanded, as the Sassoon Empire expanded, he had to figure out, who do I staff it with? Who can I trust to send to China, where letters would take weeks to arrive, and trust them to run my business once I've gone through my 8 sons. And he realized that if he went back to Baghdad and said to Jewish families in Baghdad, send me your sons, they were almost always sons, send them to me as teenagers in Bombay. I'll educate them, I'll train them, I'll give them a job. I will build a Jewish hospital, so if they get sick, they'll be taken care of. I'll build a synagogue so they can worship. I'll build a Jewish cemetery. And then he did the same thing in China. When he would send these young Jewish men to China, he would build hospitals for them and Jewish cemeteries in Shanghai and elsewhere. He was almost setting up a company town in every place where he was establishing his business. So even there was a philanthropic aspect to it, but there was also a business sense in which he developed a group of very loyal, very committed workers, most of whom were Jews from Baghdad, who he could trust, who could then, build out his business.
Flora Sassoon was another woman who I think stood out amongst people of her time and did a little bit more than what most women in her generation did. Can you tell us a little bit about how she got thrown into that role and what she accomplished?
So as I mentioned, David Sassoon had 8 sons. And he quickly realized that while China was important and India was important in terms of opium, to really become a global business dynasty, you had to be in London. And so he began to send his sons to London. And there they would buy estates, they would send their children to Eton and to Cambridge, they would entertain the British aristocracy, they actually became very close to the Prince of Wales, and it really increased their influence. They also knew how to spend their money. They spent less and less time on business and more time, at these grand parties and so forth. And so the remaining son, who was left in Bombay to run the business, died unexpectedly. And that threw the family into a bit of a crisis. They couldn't quite figure out who's going to run the business now. And so Flora Sassoon, who was the wife of the son who died, basically volunteered and said that she would run the business for a few years until their teenage son, came of age and could resume the kind of male line of succession. And the brothers in London figured, okay, that's fine. She's a woman. What can she do? She'll be easy to control. But it turned out Flora Sassoon was really a remarkable woman, a remarkable person. She had been very highly educated. She spoke several languages, and she had a real gift for business. Now, we have to remember, this was at a time when not only women couldn't vote, women in India were not even allowed to be seen in public. They lived behind what was called purdah. And so initially, Flora Sassoon was running this huge business enterprise from her living room. But over time, she began to go to the office, go to the factories in India that the Sassoons controlled. and it was a bit scandalous. And then in a situation much like we're emerging from now, there was a plague in Bombay, a bubonic plague. And the Sassoon's Indian workers were terrified of going to the factories, going to work, because they feared they would catch the plague. So Flora Sassoon went out and basically hired a number of scientists from Europe to come to India to search for a vaccine. They found a vaccine for the bubonic plague. And then Flora Sassoon insisted on getting the vaccine herself and being photographed getting the vaccine, which again was scandalous because a woman would never show her bare arm to be photographed. But she wanted her workers to know, her Indian workers to know, that this vaccine was safe. It worked. And basically, the Sassoon dynasty was really saved by her quick thinking and by her business acumen. But the brothers, her brothers-in-law back in London, started getting nervous. They began to worry that she wouldn't be so malleable, that she might, resist their efforts to control her. And so they essentially staged a boardroom coup where they repurposed the company, threw her out, and she ended up sailing to London, where she became a very well-known philanthropist and Jewish scholar, but she never set foot in the Sassoon businesses again. As a friend of mine said, she had hit the bamboo ceiling. And so again, I think you see the way in which the women in these families were, so accomplished, had such both presence of mind and business skills and compassion. And yet, because of the strictures of their time, even within their own families, their paths were often cut off, very abruptly.
The other character that stood out, I mean, they all did, but Victor Sassoon. It was another moving moment where at the end of the war, when he paid back all of his employees for the time that they could not work when they were in the Jewish ghetto there in Shanghai. But I'm jumping ahead to the end of the story. Could you tell us a little bit of his story and just what happened with the Jewish refugees and everything during
Sure.
World War II?
Yeah, I mean, if there's ever a movie or a miniseries made of this book, Victor Sassoon is going to be the star. He was really a remarkable man. So as I said, the Sassoons had kind of moved a lot of their operations to London, even as they were growing the opium trade and then other things in China. Victor Sassoon was born in Europe, and he was a playboy. Even when he was at Cambridge University, he was considered to have the best wine cellar in London. He was always seen with a chorus girl on each arm. And people just assumed he'd be one of those Sassoons who made a lot of money and then spent it. During World War I, he was a pilot during World War I, and his plane crashed, and he emerged from the crash crippled. He had lost the use of his legs. And he fell into a depression and basically concluded that he would never be able to have the kind of incredible social life that he had been enjoying up to that moment in Europe. And so he decided to go to India and to Shanghai to see if he could try his hand at business. And it turned out he was a remarkable businessman. He was a real visionary, and he essentially created the modern Shanghai, the Shanghai even that today we see. Those beautiful Art Deco buildings along the waterfront in Shanghai, known as the Bund, many of them were built by Victor Sassoon. And he also turned Shanghai into this glamorous international city. He built the Peace Hotel, which is the hotel that I visited when I was looking for the bathroom. And it became kind of one of those spots that everyone had to go to. Charlie Chaplin sailed over to go to the Cafe Hotel and see Victor Sassoon. Noel Coward wrote private lives in a suite at his hotel. Wallace Simpson, who would end up making the King of England leave his throne, was photographed in Shanghai nude except for a life jacket, which gives you a sense of what Shanghai was like. It was glamorous, it was a little bit naughty. And Victor Sassoon knew how to have a great time. He would throw these incredible parties in Shanghai where he would dress up as a ringmaster, and all the guests had to dress up as circus acts. He would dress up as a schoolmaster, and everyone had to dress up as pupils. At one point, when I was researching the book, I went to the hotel and I asked to see Victor Sassoon's suite. He built a suite at the top of the hotel so he could overlook his growing Shanghai empire. And so a Chinese fellow was showing me around, and I went into the bathroom of the suite, and there were two bathtubs there. And I turned to the Chinese fellow and I said, "Why are there two bathtubs here in the bathroom?" And he kind of blushed and he said, "Well," he said, "Victor Sassoon always said he didn't mind sharing his bed, but he didn't like sharing his bath." So that gives you a sense of what it was like to be Victor Sassoon. But starting in the late 1930s, these cruise ships that were showing up with all these wealthy celebrities and others to enjoy Shanghai started delivering a different group of people. And these were the Jewish refugees who were fleeing Nazism. Now, as we know, by the late 1930s, the Nazis had come to power in Germany, and they had moved into Austria as well. And this sent the Jews of Berlin and Vienna into panic as they were desperate to leave. But as we also know, every country in the world was shutting its doors to these Jewish refugees, turning them away, not allowing them to find refuge. But Shanghai, because it was occupied by all these different Western powers, the British had a chunk, the French had a chunk, the Americans, the Japanese were controlling part of it. There was really no functioning government in Shanghai. And that meant if you could get to Shanghai and you were a Jewish refugee, you would be safe. So word spread among the refugees, especially in Berlin and Vienna, that if they could make their way to Shanghai, there was hope for them. And so most of these were middle-class Jews, musicians, professors, lawyers, merchants. They sold their belongings and booked passage on these cruise ships, thousands of them, to show up in Shanghai. Now, Victor Sassoon and Eli Kodori were the two wealthiest businessmen in Shanghai, both Jewish. And suddenly these refugees were showing up, and they were businessmen. They didn't really know what to do, but to the credit of both of them, they both really stepped up, and they began to find housing for these refugees, employment. The Kodoris opened up a school for Jewish children because whole families were coming over, and they hired German-speaking teachers to sort of run this school. But even more remarkable, Victor Sassoon began to negotiate with the Japanese to protect these Jews. The Japanese had already invaded China, and they had essentially encircled Shanghai. They hadn't invaded Shanghai yet because they didn't want to antagonize the Americans or the British. This was before Pearl Harbor. But they named a very anti-Semitic Japanese colonel to be in charge of the Jewish problem of all these refugees who were showing up in Shanghai. And Victor Sassoon basically was a charmer, and he could charm anyone. So he started inviting this anti-Semitic captain to his hotel to have drinks with him, to have dinner. And he said, "Look, I want your officers to feel comfortable here." At the same time, he would be spying on them. He said he might invest in Japanese industry. He said that he would talk to Churchill, who he knew, to people who knew Franklin Roosevelt, to try to keep them out of the war. And essentially, he was conning the Japanese. He was trying to persuade them not to shut the gates, not to prevent Jews from landing in Shanghai, so he could protect as many as possible, sort of like Schindler's List almost. And he was successful. And ultimately, 18,000 Jews came to Shanghai. The Japanese finally caught on to what Victor was doing, and Victor had to flee. And the Kodoris, who didn't get out in time, were actually imprisoned by the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. But Victor was so effective, and the Japanese continued to believe that, even when the Gestapo showed up after Pearl Harbor, the Nazis sent members of the Gestapo to Shanghai to meet with the Japanese. And they said to them, "Look, you have a Jewish problem here. You have these 18,000 refugees. Here's what we propose you do. You gather them all up on Rosh Hashanah, when they'll all be in synagogue. You put them on barges, and you sink those barges in the middle of the river, and that'll take care of your Jewish problem." The Japanese were horrified by this. they still somehow believed that the Jews might be a good bargaining chip and that Victor Sassoon might be able to help them negotiate with the Americans. And so as a result, even though the Japanese were allies of the Nazis, even though the Japanese could be incredibly brutal towards the Chinese and the other Asian countries they occupied, they didn't kill any of the Jews who had sought refuge in Shanghai. All those Jews survived. Circumstances were difficult, there wasn't enough food, things were overcrowded, but it's really one of the miracles of World War II. And a lot of the credit goes to Victor Sassoon and to Eli Kodori, who really stepped forward to save these Jews when they needed it the most.
It's an incredible story, and I love that the cherry on top was in the book you mentioned that Victor paid all of his employees for the time that they could not work, that they were in the ghettos, that he gave them something so they could kind of rebuild their lives, which is, again, just an incredible thing from this man who I guess everyone thought was going to be the playboy of the family and not the
and actually, what was interesting about Victor is he was both. He was both an incredible playboy, and yet he also had this moment of great moral clarity. And I guess that's one of the lessons I took from the book, which is that, you know, none of us know when our moment of moral choice is going to come. You know, these families were, you know, they were in the middle of history. They didn't know it at the time, but they were having to choose over and over again. Do we get involved in the opium trade or not? Do we help the Jewish refugees or not? When the communists are arriving, do we flee Shanghai or not? And it makes me think that, you know, 50 or 100 years from now, people will look back at our time and at us and say, well, you were facing certain moral choices, and how did you respond? And in this case, you know, Victor Sassoon did the right thing, and afterwards went right back to being a playboy. You know, it was remarkable. He essentially, you know, had this heroic moment, and then once the war was over, went back to racing his horses and having his love affairs, and really never talked about it again. You know, you never quite know how people's brains work, but for him, he was able to kind of, you know, be both people at the same time.
I'm gonna pause for a second. Just I'm putting in the chat another link on Amazon just where the book is. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend everybody get a copy. Personally, the hardcover is a really nice copy. We want to make sure Jonathan's kids can go to a nice university, all their tuition and everything. So the hardcover now. It's a wonderful book, and it's interesting what you were saying a moment ago about this moment in history, because the story really chronicles it's 2 centuries, about 200 years, I think, from the beginning to the end. 1823, I believe it starts, and it ends later in the 20th century. But there's one more major event that they took part of, right? Zionism and the founding of Israel and things around that. So tell us a little bit about how these families were involved in their role in that moment in world history.
They had very different responses, and I think it frankly reflects their different attitudes towards Judaism and towards being accepted. When David Sassoon fled Baghdad, he arrived in India. Now, again, we're familiar with the story of Jews as liberals, Jews as socialists, you know, Jews being on the kind of side of the victim. But when David Sassoon arrived in Bombay, the British Empire was just about to expand into India. They were going to turn India into a colony. And David Sassoon looked at that, and he had come from an almost a royal background himself in Baghdad. He had been, you know, carried to meet the Pasha, an incredibly wealthy family. And so he decided to side not with the Indian workers or others. He decided to side with the British. He actually became quite an Anglophile. Even though he himself never learned English, he insisted that all of his sons learn English. He hired British tutors to teach them British history. And in fact, when Queen Victoria became queen, he stood on the kind of waterfront of Bombay in their Arab robes and sang "God Save the Queen" in English. And as a result, the Sassoons were accepted very quickly into British society. They were knighted. They became friends with the Prince of Wales and others. In fact, when the Prince of Wales became king, Churchill, who knew the Sassoons quite well, wrote to a friend and said, I wonder if the king is going to bring his Jews with him to Buckingham Palace. And that was a reference to the Sassoons. And in fact, the king did. He would go on vacations and rest cures with the Sassoons. In that sense, he was very open-minded. So the Sassoons were accepted in a way into British society. And as we know, when Jews start assimilating, they often start moving away from observant Judaism. And that was certainly true of the Sassoons. Many of them intermarried. That caused great tension in the family. And today, the Sassoons are, they're Jewish and they talk about that, but they are not, their religion is not that important to them. The Kodoris were different. Eli Kodori had left Baghdad, worked for the Sassoons, gone off on his own, made a lot of money, married Laura, and returned. And he was desperate to emulate the Sassoons. He wanted to become British. But the British at this point really didn't want to give him citizenship. In fact, at one point, I came across a document in Hong Kong, which was a British colony. And it's one of the British officials saying, we don't want to give Eli Kodori British citizenship because then we'll have to do it for all the rest of them, which clearly referred to these other Jews who were seeking British citizenship. And so Eli Kodori kept on being turned down for British citizenship until he finally realized, I think Laura probably told him, that if he gave a lot of money to charities that were favored by the royal family, that was a way to kind of win favor and get citizenship. And he was ultimately knighted, and the Kodoris kind of then entered the British kind of aristocracy as well. But they always retained this sense of being outsiders. And so as a result, they became Zionists. And in the late, just before 1920, when the Balfour Declaration was issued, that was ultimately would lead to the creation of the State of Israel, Eli Kodori was put in charge of trying to get support for it in Asia because he had so many business contacts. And he wrote a letter to Sun Yat-sen, who is sort of the George Washington of China. And he wrote to him and said, would you endorse the Balfour Declaration? Sun Yat-sen was the first president of a Republic of China after the emperor had been toppled. And he wrote Eli this extraordinary letter where he said, my country is being occupied by foreigners. You Jews have lost your homeland. We both have a common aim of restoring ourselves to our homeland and finding a home and returning our home to us. And he endorsed the Balfour Declaration and eventually the creation of the State of Israel. And so, again, that was a way in which China, from the very earliest days, ordinary Chinese felt this connection with Jews, who they felt were an ancient people who had lost their homeland and were trying to regain it. And I think that's another thing that you feel today when you talk to the Chinese about their views of Jews. They feel this connection because of these, political and almost spiritual ties that Eli Kodori created with, some of the founders of modern China.
Great. Just as a point of, let me put myself back on the screen here. Just as a point for everybody watching us, if you have questions, please send them to me in the chat, and we'll take some questions from the audience now. I have one more question first, though, for you, Jonathan. The story begins with, as you described, the time in Babylon and Baghdad was actually one of the high points of Jewish society until it wasn't. It was one of the greatest times of Jewish literature and knowledge and learning until it wasn't. It wasn't safe anymore there. And similarly, a lot of, certainly my generation don't realize that Germany before the Nazis was also one of the high points of Jewish life throughout the history and the diaspora. And it was until it wasn't. So my question is this something that, not is it inevitable, but were there signs before things got bad in Baghdad and David Sassoon had to flee in the night with Jules sewn into his garments. Were there warning signs? Were there things that were predictors? Is this are there lessons we can learn to stop this from happening, or is this
Yeah.
what happens when Jews live in another society? We're loved, and just like the Sassoons of the anti-Semitism you mentioned in the background with Winston Churchill and others, we're loved until we're not.
Right. Well, I think, part of what happens, and I would argue this is true in Baghdad, it was true in Germany, and it's also, frankly, was true in Shanghai, which is that it's easy to get seduced by acceptance, right? What is common in all these situations is Jews become very accepted, very influential. They are lionized. They have prominent positions. And so if there are whispers out there that, things may not all be good, Jews often, as none of us would, right? You leave home without taking an umbrella, even if you read there's going to be a storm. It's sometimes hard to kind of pair your own experience, which may be very strong and very positive, with these warning signs. So what happens in a place like Shanghai, for example, is that, Victor Sassoon is living this extraordinary life. The Kodoris are living in a 43-room mansion with 42 servants. What can happen? But of course, the communists are gathering throughout the rest of China. And I think that the Sassoons and the Kodoris, and I suspect this was probably true for David Sassoon in Baghdad and was also true for Jews in Berlin, they were living in a bubble, right? They were surrounding themselves with people who thought like them, even if they were, not Jewish. The people they would meet in parties and so forth were people who respected them or admired them. And they didn't hear the rumblings in the distance. In fact, Victor Sassoon, who was a brilliant businessman, he was having an affair with a Jewish woman writer, Emily Hahn, who wrote for The New Yorker. And at the same time, she was having an affair with a left-wing communist writer. And she got to meet some communists, including, I think, Zhou Enlai, in the 30s. And she has lunch with Victor Sassoon at one point, and she says to him, Victor, you got to take this communist thing seriously, And Victor dismisses her and says, no, the Chinese I know, the nationalist Chinese I know, the rich Chinese businessmen I know, say the communists are nothing to worry about. I'll always be safe. Until he wasn't. And so I think if there's something that ties the Jewish experience together, it's that, Jews always get seduced by success, as anybody would. And yet, when the alarm bells go off, the question is, when are they really alarm bells that a fire's about to happen? And when is there more just it's not going to be a real problem? Obviously, I think it's something that Jews think about a lot today in Western Europe, in Canada, in the US. Jews feel very safe. They feel very accepted. They feel, beloved in many ways. And so when things happen like anti-Semitic attacks or the Charlottesville riots or incidents in Europe, we sort of are trying to judge how much should we worry about these things. And so I guess the only advice is that it's important not to be in a bubble, that even if there are uncomfortable truths out there or there are scary things happening, we need to be aware of them, because you don't want to be like David Sassoon having to flee Baghdad, or the Jews who, didn't get out of Berlin, or today, Jews who may feel are these societies as accepting as we have always hoped they are?
It's one of those important questions, because we also don't want to be on the opposite side of sounding the alarm too soon or too early, which we see happening as well sometimes. It's a tough balance. I wanted to ask a couple of questions that I'm getting here in the chat, and a few of them are related, so I'm going to try to push them together a bit. But the question is, does understanding these families help us to understand what's happening in present day China? And someone else asked about the Kodoris and their relationship with the current Chinese government. If that.
Yeah. The Kodoris are in a very difficult position. Victor Sassoon, as I said, after World War II, he returns to China. He thinks the parties are going to continue, but they don't, obviously. The communists come to power. He flees Shanghai. He gets a round trip ticket, but he never returns to Shanghai. He loses almost everything because most of his money at this point is in real estate in Shanghai. And he ends up living in a kind of exile in the Bahamas, where he becomes quite bitter about China. In fact, he says at one point, "I didn't leave China, China left me." He acts almost like a spurned lover. The Kodoris respond differently. They flee Shanghai. They lose a tremendous amount, but they go to Hong Kong because they're convinced that at some point, China, even communist China, will need to kind of reconnect with the world. And so the Kodoris in Hong Kong become part of this remarkable effort to turn Hong Kong into the sort of remarkable modern city that it becomes. They rebuild their fortune, and they're today worth about $13 billion, and they're the richest Western family in China. They become very influential. They meet with the president of China, Xi Jinping, and others. Nevertheless, the past couple of years have been very frightening for them. I think that had this book come out 3 years ago, it would have been much more optimistic because it looked as if China was, becoming more part of a globalized world and was easing things up, welcoming tourists, all the things that, we remember from a few years ago. But now with the Chinese cracking down on Hong Kong, the Kodoris are trying to figure out what to do. About half their money, $7 or $8 billion, is in China or in Hong Kong. They own the electric company, they own the Peninsula Hotel chain, they own nuclear power plants. I mean, these are not things you can like pack into a suitcase and leave with. They have huge investments in China. And they've always been very careful to work with the Chinese government. That was one of the lessons they took from what happened in Shanghai. They didn't want to be living in a bubble. They've always tried to have contact with the government. And when China opened up again in the 70s, they turned to the Kodoris, and the Kodoris have been very influential. These days, the Kodoris are being very careful. They have not criticized the Chinese government. But I know there are members of the family that are very nervous. They wonder, will a kind of resurgent China allow this Western company, this British company, to make so much money? Is that something that the Chinese see as in their interest? So the power has really shifted. And I think the challenges and the worries that Kodoris have are the same ones that Apple has and Zoom has, any company has dealing with China right now, because the Chinese hold all the cards. And if the government decides it doesn't want you to do business or doesn't want you to criticize some policy, they can cut you off. And so I think the Kodoris, like many Western companies, are walking a tightrope, trying to figure out how do they succeed, how do they do business, but also, once again, retain a sense of morality that allows them to live their values.
One of the comments somebody had, someone also with the last name Sassoon, but they say no relation, that when they were visiting in China, so much respect was shown to them, right? They were embarrassed by it, that the story of the Sassoons was very, very well known, it seems, amongst the Chinese. Is this something that is very common throughout China, or is this just in the major cities or among the wealthy? Like when I went to UC Davis, 6 hours of drive from LA, I met people from other parts of California that had never met a Jew before. So to hear that in China, it's such a common bit of knowledge, the story of these two Jewish families and their relationship, I guess that's my question. How much is that story part of the Chinese culture?
I think it's a story, certainly in a place like Shanghai, certainly in the cities. I was giving a talk actually a couple of months ago to a group in Los Angeles, and one of the men on the call is a businessman, American businessman, and he described going to Shanghai, being in a taxi with his translator, and mentioning that he wanted to go see the neighborhood where the Jews, had been kept during the war, And the cab driver said, "Oh, yes, we Chinese were very good during the war. We helped the Jews." So I think there's a way in which there's kind of a pride that ordinary Chinese are hearing about. My book is actually going to be published in China, um, translated and published, which again surprised me because given the tensions between the West and China right now. But I think that's a sign that the Chinese do want to understand this history. And also from their point of view, it shows that China was a sophisticated cosmopolitan place, even in the 1870s, 1880s, and the early 1900s. And so I think it's a history that's kind of useful for them. But I also think part of it is rooted in this feeling that the Chinese have that, they admire Jewish values. I mean, yes, they think we're good at business, but they like our emphasis on the family, on education. They see kind of a connection. And I think when they hear about the Sassoons and the Kodoris, there's kind of a glamour around it. The Cafe Hotel, for example, where I went to use the bathroom, Chinese tour groups go there now to sort of learn what Shanghai was like in the 30s. It's become sort of a tourist spot as well. And it's a kind of history that the Chinese can feel proud of, and they want to know more about.
Um, I'm curious, what about the Sassoon and the Kodori families? Did they appreciate hearing you were writing this book? And how did they feel about having their stories shared?
The Sassoons, well, typically journalists we don't share our articles with sources before we run them. And in this case, though, I felt I was essentially writing a biography of these two families, and I didn't want to, have mistakes in the book. I didn't want them writing a letter, saying their inaccuracies. And as my agent pointed out, you don't necessarily want to get into an argument with a family worth $13 billion. So I sent a draft of the book to the heads of both families. And Lord Sassoon, who's in the House of Lords, who's the head of the Sassoon family, I wrote to him and I said, this is what I plan to write. If you see any mistakes, please let me know, but understand that the historical interpretation is my own. And he wrote back a very gracious letter, very British, where he basically said, there were some errors, Grandma was born in 1896, not 1897, a few more family stories. But also he said, as you say, interpretations may differ, but I wish you the best of luck. And I've since heard from members of the Sassoon family that there were many things in the book they didn't know, because obviously the history you hear around the kitchen table isn't real history. The Kodoris were more complicated. They had never really been written about. And so I think they were a little more nervous about it. But in the end, they were kind of very, very generous and I think appreciated not just what I wrote, but the reception of the book. It's been a bestseller in Hong Kong and it's gotten very positive reviews. And the fact that it's coming out in China, I think, made them feel like, okay, they're not going to get into trouble. So the families were good with it. And in the end, I think part of what's so interesting is, while it's a book about China and it's a book about Jews and all that, it's also a book about families. And so I think, to write about these families, how brothers would argue with brothers, how the women were treated, how fathers dealt with their sons, in some ways that's as painful for the families as talking about the opium trade, because, they were families. And I think that the book kind of captures, even when you're worth a lot of money, even when you're living in China, the tensions that families go through are something that everybody shares.
And it's a great chance to plug the book one more time. It's a fantastic read and really captures those moments, those the multiplicity of people, right? We're complex, we're complicated, and you really do capture the different sides of all of these characters, from the philanthropist to the playboy for Victor Sassoon, David Sassoon, from imperialist to someone also that gave back to the Jewish community, and the women that really, I think, to me stood out, Laura and Flora. Did I get that right? Flora.
Yes,
Um, my last question, unrelated to this book, but I feel like I have to ask it. It's very much in the news, and I want to be respectful of your time, so you don't have to give too long of an answer. But your previous book, it's published a while back now, Broken Alliance, The Turbulent Times Between Blacks and Jews in America, where it talks about the relationship between the Black community and the Jewish community. And I think that's something that's been more and more on the radar for people, is Jews of color becoming more prominent and being highlighted in the Jewish world, as well as topics like Israel are becoming more and more divisive. I've had Black conversion students that tell me they don't wear their Star of David, their Magen David on university campuses, because in their friend circles they don't want to be labeled as a Zionist. And we've had here just very recently Annemie Paul, the leader of the Green Party, has come under some flack for her Jewishness as a Black woman and a leader of a liberal party. So the two communities, while we think have a lot in common and a lot of similarities, are not getting along very well at the moment. And is there a hope for a better future, or how did we get here? Can we fix it?
yeah.
30 seconds,
The sad part of it is that when Blacks and Jews work together, they're enormously effective. Jews were very influential in the early stages of the Black struggle, but certainly during the civil rights movement in the United States. 3/4 of the money given to Martin Luther King, for example, came from Jewish donors. When we see those pictures of Blacks and others being attacked down south in the 60s, 3/4 of the whites who went down south were Jews. And even through to today, the fact that America has a Black vice president married to a Jewish husband, you would think would say something pretty remarkable about the alliance between Blacks and Jews. But I think the fact is that Blacks and Jews are often a creation, their relationships, of the broader atmosphere. And in the early 60s, when Martin Luther King and others were bringing together people to push ahead civil rights, Blacks and Jews were part of that. And then in the late 1960s, when Black Power arose and other tensions arose, they split apart. I would argue that actually Barack Obama, in many ways, was the culmination of a Black-Jewish alliance. Many of Obama's top advisors were Jews he met in Chicago. One of Michelle Obama's cousins had actually converted and became a rabbi. I often joke that Barack Obama was the first Jewish president. His mother-in-law lived with him in the White House. He had the first Passover Seder hosted in the White House, was hosted by Barack and Michelle Obama. His views on Israel may not have kind of been what all Jews wanted to hear, but he certainly represented a kind of bringing people together. Under Trump, it's been very different. And I think, as we know, we're living in a very polarized time. And I think that when you're looking for a fight, Blacks and Jews can often find something to fight over. And Israel is a very divisive issue. And I think one of the things that Blacks and Jews need to sort out, that all coalitions need to sort out, is, can you agree on some things and disagree on others? I think we're reaching a point, frankly, on both the left and the right, where the attitude is, well, it's my way or the highway on everything, right? Everyone has a checklist of all the issues we want you to either speak out about or be silent about or take my position on before we'll work with you on local things or on anything else. So I think that, I'm going to be teaching a course on this, which on a university campus may be somewhat explosive, but I think one of the things we're trying to talk to students about is the need to work together. And maybe you'll disagree about certain things. Maybe you won't, Israel may not be the first topic you talk about. Find some issues you can talk about, whether it's rise in anti-Semitism, rise in racist acts, and things like that. So, I'm hopeful for the future, because I'm always hopeful about the future, but it does feel like we're in a time now where tensions are just boiling over. And I often feel like Blacks and Jews are like these two wrestlers in an arena. They're sort of fighting each other, and yet they ignore the people watching who are neither Black nor Jewish. They're often very conservative. and they like it when blacks and Jews fight because it does hurt liberal causes. It does create more and more tension, and I wish we could get away from that, but unfortunately, I'm not terribly optimistic in the short term.
Well, what you said about trying to find the common ground, it's one of the things I love about Israel's new government, and we'll see how that works out in the long term. But here you have a coalition of three very different groups with very different views, but on a lot of things they do agree when it comes to education, infrastructure, things like that. So we'll see if they can hold that coalition together with what they agree on with versus what they disagree on. Jonathan, it's really been a pleasure to get to speak with you. One more time, just for everybody here. Whoops, that's the wrong screen. There we go. The Last Kings of Shanghai. It's really, really a phenomenal read. I highly recommend it to everybody. I want to thank you, Jonathan, and thank everyone. And I'm going to thank Sue for all of what she does with Classi Lectures to put these programs together. And I will pass it over to her one last time to have the final word with us.
Well, I think it was just fantastic evening. I think, Jonathan, much as I'm going to recommend the book again, I think we want to have you back to talk about politics and about general race relations. I think it'd be a great program. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Rabbi, for a fantastic interview. And thank you, Gail, for helping to put this together. And we hope to see you back in Toronto again.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
And don't forget, everybody, to join us next Wednesday when we've got the next book. Rachel Florence Adler, Swims Forever. I'm talking to Rachel Beanland, and Gail Kurtzman is going to be interviewing her. So thanks, everyone.